So I'm going to talk about this simple little topic of evaluation in politics. Interacting with Julia and Linda, we decided that might be an appropriate focus. And as you can all tell, I'm an old man, and what old men do is tell stories. So that's part of what I'm going to do, is tell some stories about this. Some of the stories some of you have heard have been around for a while. So these will be ritual retellings of stories. And for others, it may be somewhat new. And then towards the end, I will take advantage of one of the few advantages there are to becoming old, and that is turn curmudgeonly about some of what is going on. But let's begin with, I wanted to locate myself for you in the beginning of my own development experience, which was as a Peace Corps volunteer in Burkina Faso in the 1960s, doing agricultural extension and well digging and some community development and school building. And in the course of last night, deciding I would catch up with what was going on in Burkina Faso, I Googled Burkina Faso. And it was intriguing. The first entree that came up, as one might expect, was Wikipedia. But the second listing sort of freaked me out. And I invite you to try it for yourself. The second listing, when you Google Burkina Faso, is the CIA website. And so I preface our discussion of politics by suggesting we may be being watched. In fact, let's just assume that that is the case and behave accordingly. Indeed, the theme of my remarks, such as they are, is that we always have to be prepared for politics. Assume politics, not treat it as the exception, but as a constant, as part of the territory. And I'll share some examples of that. This is the picture that's on the CIA website of a sandstorm that is going across Burkina. My own experience was in Fadangorma, about halfway between Niamey and Ouagadougou. As a young man in the 60s, we were working with the Gourma people. About a million people in that area speak the Guarmanche language. Gourma is the word for human being in the Guarmanche language. What they called me was bon piano, which translates as white thing. And in many of the villages I worked, I was the first bon piano in those areas, and it was a transformative experience. It set me on the pathway to be with you today. I had the opportunity to be a part of the launching of the African Evaluation Association. I see some fellow launchers in the room in Niamey in 1999, and I was hoping that there would be some representatives from Burkina. The Gourma are not the majority group, but the Mosi are, and there were two Mosi representatives, but actually one of the three representatives from Burkina Faso was Gourma, and I sought him out. We had lunch at the UN compound the very first day, caught up on the news from Fadangorma, the land of the Gourma. The road between Ouaga and Niamey had been paved. All the international agencies were now working there. As we talked, I reminded him that when I was there, I was called bon piano, and imagining that perhaps a certain, shall we say, political correctness might have reached even the bush, I asked him if I came back today, would I still be called bon piano? He said, no, we wouldn't call you bon piano now. I said, so what would I be called? And he said, Juan piano. I'd been away from the language a long time. I said, Juan piano? He said, yeah, old white thing. Which is how I come to you today with all of the miles that suggest and the inevitable limitations of perspective that come with that. Now, one of the ritual retellings I like to be sure that goes on, a number of you know this story, but for some it's new, and I like to make sure that everybody knows how we began, because it is partly a political story. One of the few universals among human beings is every group has a creation story about how that particular group of people came to be. And so as we became a group, community of practice with particular perspectives and norms and values, we needed a creation story. And it appeared and goes like this. In the beginning. That's how you know it's a creation story. You with me so far here after lunch? All right. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and God saw everything that was made. Behold, God said, it is very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And on the seventh day, God rested from all work. God's archangel came then asking, God, how do you know that what you created is very good? What are your criteria? On what data do you base that judgment? Just what results were you hoping to achieve? And aren't you a little close to the situation to make a fair and unbiased judgment? God thought about these questions all that day, and God's rest was greatly disturbed. On the eighth day, God said, Lucifer, go to hell. Thus was evaluation born in a blaze of glory, so to speak. And to this day, many people associate us with the dark side. In that story is power relationships. Is that phrase that you hear a great deal and that Ray has repeated a number of times, the challenge of speaking truth to power. And what is embedded in that story is that before we even speak whatever truth we may find to power, our interactions typically begin by asking questions of those in power. And they don't like that piece much more than they like the findings. So it is not just speaking, but questioning. How do you know what you know? How do you know that you're doing good? That engages us in a particularly important role that is inherently political. That's what we do. I was president of AEA in 1988, which was a presidential election year in the United States, and one of the things the president does is pick the conference theme for that year. So the theme I picked was evaluation and politics, and this was a walk down memory lane for me to think about this today. In those days, this is a tradition that has been lost over time, but in those days, the theme provoked an essay contest where members were invited to write essays, and a group judged the essays, and there was a winner, the President's Prize for the theme. And so this was a time when we had moved or were moving from the early days that I would describe as relatively politically naive, when evaluators thought they might be above the fray of politics, to having come of age and realizing that all of what we did was be politically mired in some way or another, but had come to that realization to the point where everything began to be political, and it was hard to not make that meaningless. So the question I posed to the membership was, what aspects of evaluation, or when is evaluation not political? And the winning essay was very short and to the point and insightful, I think. Evaluation is not political under the following conditions, all of which must be met. No one cares about the program. No one knows about the program. There is no money at stake. No power or authority is at stake. And no one in the program making decisions about the program or otherwise involved in, knowledgeable about, or attached to the program is sexually active. If you encounter a program that meets all of those conditions, you do not have to worry about politics. Otherwise, it is part of the territory. So I want to look with you at three arenas among many where politics often trumps evaluation, and talk about some of what we can do about that by being prepared. The first is ignoring evaluation findings, and my 40-year career has been devoted to trying to increase the utility and actual use of evaluations. And the stakes for using evaluations can get quite high. I come from Minnesota, Minneapolis and St. Paul, north central part of the U.S., just on the Canadian border. And on August 1st, 2007, the major superhighway that connects Minneapolis and St. Paul collapsed at rush hour. 13 people died. There would have been more died. This is the highway that crosses the Mississippi River that begins there and runs all the way to New Orleans. But the river was at drought stage, and the bridge actually broke on all four corners at once and fell relatively flat. So, for example, the school bus filled with children did not topple off into the river. An investigation ensued in which they found that the gusset plates that connect the vertical and horizontal columns of the bridge were deficient and had cracked, and that's the reason at rush hour you see a cement truck. There were some repairs going on up in the upper left-hand part of the picture. The bridge could not sustain that amount of weight, and it collapsed. They further found that a year before the collapse, the bridge had been routinely inspected. Photographs had been taken of the cracked plates. A report had been filed to the Department of Transportation saying that the bridge was unsafe and needed to be repaired. And the information was filed and not used. The bridge collapse is a story of ignoring evaluation findings. In the International Evaluation Conference in Toronto in 2005, the joint associations of the Canadians and Americans and colleagues sponsoring the conference gave an award for the evaluation work that was done on the Rwanda genocide. It was one of the first joint evaluations that was done looking at the emergency assistance to Rwanda. It's, of course, a chilling report. And it tells the story of General Romeo Dallaire, who was the Canadian Lieutenant General who was in charge of United Nations peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, who, without the title, became an evaluator because all he was able to do was file reports on what was happening in the deteriorating situation in Rwanda. And he filed those reports up through the chain of command, requesting just a few more troops to keep the Hutu and the Tutsi apart. He was monitoring communications. He was forecasting what was about to happen. And the world ignored his reports, and 800,000 people perished. General Dallaire was awarded the first International Speaking Truth to Power Award at that conference for his efforts to alert the world to what was going on. Since that time, a number of the world's leaders have returned to Rwanda to apologize for ignoring the data, including President Bill Clinton, who in his memoir about his presidency says that ignoring the data from Rwanda he considers the biggest mistake of his presidency and the most tragic. So ignoring the findings comes with very high stakes. Now what you see here is that the image that I have adopted in my writings and training for the evaluator is the image of the medieval jester. Because the job of the medieval jester was to speak truth to power in a way that could be heard. In a way that could be heard. Monarchs surround themselves, as do policymakers today, with people who tell them what they want to hear. And this institutionalized role of the jester was a recognition that monarchs need to have somebody tell them what's really going on. And anybody who's currying favor with power is not going to do that. And so there became this specialized role, and I view us as descendants of the jester, whose job was to monitor what was going on and figure out how to get the monarch aware of that information. And if the jester did a good job, the jester was rewarded. And if the jester did a bad job, the jester wasn't around anymore, a theme to which we shall return momentarily. Jesting is serious business because speaking truth to power is serious business. A second form of power relations with evaluation is suppressing findings. There are countless stories of this. I'm only going to quickly share two. One comes from Eleanor Cholimsky, who was the Director of Program Evaluation and Methodology Division for the U.S. Accountability Office from 1980 to 1994, former AEA president, organized and co-chaired the first International Evaluation Conference in Vancouver in 1995. And both Ray and Linda worked for Eleanor at GAO and in the Institute, and Ray was the deputy director under Eleanor. And she has written and filled pages of books with stories about figuring out how politics worked both domestically and internationally. One of my favorite Eleanor stories is, again, alerting us as evaluators to what we need to expect and be prepared to deal with. Attempts by those in power to hide needed data from evaluators and therefore the public, or to suppress government evaluation findings by classifying reports as top secret. So she says, evaluators will have to learn to deal with secrecy even as it expands to grotesque levels, and even as happened to us, they are faced with the bizarre situation in which their report, the evaluator's report, is classified so high that they, the evaluators who wrote it, are no longer allowed to read it. During the Bush years, the Centers for Disease Control, one of the most prestigious and important institutions in the world in cooperation with the World Health, the Bush administration that was pushing abstinence-only education programs interfered with the scientific work on sex education programs going on at CDC and prevented them from tracking results and suppressed the dissemination of other scientific information on sex education programs. At the behest of higher-ups in the Bush administration, the CDC was forced to discontinue a project called Programs at Work, which identified sex education programs found to be effective in evaluation studies. All 5 of the programs identified in 2002 involved comprehensive sex education for teenagers, and none were abstinence-only programs. In ending the project, the CDC removed all information about the effective programs from their websites. Now, I use this particular example. I happened to be working with people at CDC at that time, and AEA had begun doing some collaborative workshops there. And the atmosphere at CEC was one of tremendous fear. It was the only time in my professional career doing workshops where people would not engage in conversation. They wouldn't answer the simplest questions because they were afraid of what would get reported out. And I came away from that experience chilled that if this can happen at CDC, among the most professional, prestigious, independent organizations in the world dealing with the most serious kind of health issues, every institution is vulnerable. There's techniques of delaying release of information rather than suppressing findings. There's cherry picking of findings, lots of these stories. But let me share just one other area with you, which is executing the Jester, undermining and killing effective evaluation units. Evaluation institutions, I think, are especially vulnerable. And it's important, it seems to me, for us as a community of evaluators. You're all located in various places in this incredible matrix of global evaluation that has emerged in the last few years. But the locations of evaluators and evaluation units is quite diverse, and in my experience is always vulnerable to the changing powers that be and the whims of support that go on. I experienced this firsthand. In 1975, I became director of one of the first evaluation methodology training programs in the world. We had predoctoral and postdoctoral training. It was an interdisciplinary program that involved 17 different academic departments from across the university. We had 8 Regents professors involved in the program, the highest status professors with endowed chairs. We ran seminars with state officials and and NGO leaders, private sector. It was a very diverse program, and we were attracting a lot of attention. During those 5 years, I placed some 50 people into key positions around the state of Minnesota. And in 1980, the University of Minnesota went through a strategic planning process where they decided to refocus on traditional academic disciplines and get rid of interdisciplinary programs. And this program was shut down. And I became aware of the whims of change. The Reagan administration from 1980 to 1988, and GAO did extensive documentation of this, shut down government units across the federal government. The program evaluation and methodology division itself that Ray and Linda were in and that Eleanor created gave us so much rich material, published cutting-edge methodology pieces of the likes of which we had not seen before, demonstrated incredible mixed methods of approaches to the most difficult kinds of issues, had a huge impact upon congressional legislation, upon public policy, upon our knowledge. And in 1994 was shut down. And now we come to a more sensitive issue locally, the status of the IDRC evaluation unit. This is the curmudgeonly part of my presentation. And I realize that what I'm about to say can be perceived as meddlesome and perhaps inappropriate and undiplomatic. But if we're going to speak truth to power, we have to speak truth to each other. And that's what I intend to bring forward to us. The International Development Research Center Evaluation Unit here in Ottawa has been, for the last 2 decades, one of the premier evaluation units in the world and have contributed hugely to our community through things like outcome mapping, through the evaluating organizational strategy as a unit of analysis, the rolling project completion reports that they innovated, created an annual learning forum. They were the first to adopt developmental evaluation as a program reporting framework, have been hugely important in support for evaluation capacity building throughout the developing world, and have worked with the tensions between learning and accountability, written about that, managed that, have been insightful about dealing with those issues. As recently as a month ago, the Canadian newspapers were reporting that 10 of the 14 positions on the board of IDRC were vacant, and whether or not IDRC itself would continue to exist was uncertain. As I take it, it still may be with what has happened with the merger of CETA. And I now have heard that some of these positions have been filled, but they're not being filled by people with development expertise. As I Googled Burkina Faso, I Googled IDRC and was surprised to be taken to a site that deciphers internet slang. It turns out that IDRC means I don't really care. Like LOL, IDRC, I don't really care. Well, I do care. In my utilization-focused evaluation book, which a number of you are familiar with, I devote almost an entire chapter to the IDRC's evaluation unit as an exemplar of what evaluation units can be, both in contributing to an organization, but to global development and to the evaluation community. So it seems to me that if I'm in the position of holding up IDRC as an exemplar, and it no longer is, it behooves me to go on the record expressing concern about that until I can get the next edition out and correct the record. And so that's part of what is going on. And the questions that I would raise in that regard: should we care as an international evaluation community, what happens to evaluation at IDRC? Do we have the right to care? Should we weigh in individually and collectively? Should we send a message as an international community of practice that we care and that we are watching, that the whole world is watching? It seems to me that we should, and I at least want to go on record as saying that from my position, IDRC, because of its extraordinary role in evaluation, is not just an internal issue of management for themselves or even for the Canadian government. I consider myself, as a 40-year evaluation veteran and dedicated to this profession, a stakeholder of the IDRC evaluation unit. And that what happens there matters to our community. And it's a reminder of the vulnerability. Now, this story is still in play. It's not over, but many of the things that has been exemplary at IDRC are no longer there. The unit has been merged, perhaps submerged, and so these are things to pay attention to, and they raise the specter for me of the vulnerability of an institution like IPDET. And I mentioned this to call to your attention as IPDET 2013. Do not take this for granted. Do not take this for granted. Yes, 13 years, and it could be gone like that. Ray and Linda have created something extraordinary, not seen in this world before, that we are all benefiting from. And Julia has joined that team. And I want to have us in this moment, while we are together and while it still exists, to express our appreciation and be mindful of and let it settle on you that this is an extraordinary institution and a frail and vulnerable institution in the whims of change. Let's express appreciation for Ray and Linda and Julia. And each of you will play a role going forward in protecting and nurturing and sustaining this. Do not depend upon them to carry this forward alone. We are a community of practice. Evaluation institutes are frail and vulnerable. Things change. And we have to be vigilant as a community, or we will lose what we have. So what can evaluators do in the face of politics? A very quick few thoughts. One of the standards in the Joint Committee standards addresses political viability. And it calls for, whilst planning and conducting the evaluation, one must anticipate the different positions of various interest groups so that their cooperation may be obtained. This will also allow one to avert or counteract any possible attempts by these groups to obstruct evaluation operations or to bias or misapply the evaluation results. The standards make it our responsibility to be politically adept, astute, sophisticated, skilled, engaged, and to understand that politics comes with the territory. Expect it, get good at it, deal with it. It is the nature of the beast. Create a strong values base from which to engage in politics. We engage in politics best if we take the offensive rather than the defensive, if we are assertive about what we bring and what we represent. Bob Stake, one of our great pioneers, wrote one of my favorite articles he published in the American Journal of Evaluation called Beyond Neutrality, What Evaluators Care About. I'm talking about caring today. Talking about caring, not being neutral, not being stone-faced, but that we care about things. And in this article, Bob said that the notion that we are neutral about the effectiveness of programs comes with the territory. But it doesn't mean that as human beings we don't care about things. And indeed, what we do care about is what gives us our credibility to be neutral about our evaluation work. He suggested that we often care about the thing being evaluated. Do you really want an evaluator who's neutral about community violence, genocide, violence against women, hunger, poverty? It's okay to care. We as evaluation professionals care about evaluation and about our community and the institutions that engage in evaluation. We advocate rationality. We care to be heard. We are troubled if our studies are not used. We are distressed by underprivilege. We see gaps among privileged patrons and managers and staff and underprivileged participants in communities. And we are advocates of a democratic society and engagement and dialogue in dealing with the data. So I urge you in closing that we as a community, while we focus on technical and methodological things and the business that we have to do and the quality issues, that we also as a community ought to think big, articulate the evaluation dream of an authentic, experimenting, global learning community making a difference on the challenges facing humankind. Nelson Mandela, who may not be with us very much longer, has said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. I would offer a further amendment to that on behalf of IPDET 213 and our community, that evaluation is a powerful weapon you can use to change the world when evaluation is used and educates. I feel very proud to be a part of this community, to get to know you all, and so I offer these cautions out of this deep caring that we are able to continue to do the important things that we do, and to recognize that while we do technical work, we are not just technicians. We have an important role to play in making the world a better place, and I feel privileged to join you in that capacity. Thank you very much.